My name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to another indie book review. Today I am reviewing Soulscape by KR Stevenson. This is a high fantasy Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I originally got it into my head that it was a monster romance, and I don't know why, because when I went and I looked back at the email that the author sent me, it didn't explicitly use the phrase monster romance. It's much more of a shifter romance, and it feels nitpicky to anyone not in the know. But if you are specifically looking for a monster romance, you don't want a shifter romance. If you know, you know. But regardless, this is all about a young woman named Blaze who has ended up a refugee from the evil empire wiping out her city, and has joined up with a lot of other people to fight back against that evil empire, and through plot ends up nearly dead on the island of Grim Atoll, which is cursed, along with its master, a healer named Kelith, and romance ensues, as is your standard A Beauty and the Beast retelling. Now, I'm going to start with my struggles with the book first, and then we'll end on a positive note. So the first bit of struggle was the actual Beauty and the Beast elements felt a little shoehorned in, like a little forced into a pre-existing plot as opposed to the basis of the plot. Obviously, I won't talk about spoilers, but there were multiple plot points where I was like, oh, this is an homage to the original, but it was either glossed over or like quickly retconned, like not a big deal. Kelith isn't, like, he doesn't have a temper. His temper isn't a big deal. Like, a lot was changed and is like, okay, we have it in here to be a Beauty and the Beast, but now we're going to change it entirely so that the Beauty and the Beast part didn't really matter to have this other story. And it doesn't have to be a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Like, it can just be a fantasy romance. And I wouldn't usually nitpick that kind of thing, but because this book is so big, it is over 600 pages, you really feel the length if everything is not geared towards the end goal or geared towards the plot as a whole. This does not mean that I dislike it for it being long. I have reviewed books upwards of 800 to 900 pages at times, but the trick is, if you're going to write a book this thick, everything still needs to feel important. You don't want it to ever feel like the book is spinning its wheels, because then people will start to be like, okay, why is it this big? And speaking of another way it could have been slimmed down considerably, let's talk writing style. Early on, I wrote down that the writing style felt like purple prose in my notes, but the longer I went on, I was like, no, it's not purple prose, because it's not particularly poetic. It's much more academic, and it took me until maybe even the 200 page mark to be like, I know what it is. It is the kind of writing a college student will do when they have an essay with a minimum word count and they want to seem smart, so they use a bunch of big words, even if the big words kind of like interrupt the flow of what they're trying to say. For example, there is one moment in the plot, things are happening, and Kelith is moving with agonized and cautious movements, but the narrative doesn't say, Kelith's movements were agonized and cautious. It says agony and caution were the dominant traits in Kelith's movements. Like, it picked very weirdly passive sentence structure and a lot of really big words that felt like they were in there just to be fancy big words, as opposed to what would be natural in that space. And yes, both of the main characters are educated. Kelith is an ancient with a ton of knowledge, and Blaze was going to university before the evil empire came in, so they're intelligent, but like, just because you went to the schooling doesn't mean you actually talk with all of those big words all the time. Like, I have multiple degrees. I was, going to classes with, people with doctorates, and you still talk naturally. Like, there's very much a difference between colloquialisms and just everyday language and academic language. And so the fact that the hyper academic language kept popping up, and it felt like so many of the sentences were reworded to have a longer word count. Like, you could shave off, not like a ton, not like 200 pages or whatever, but it felt like a lot could have been shaved off, and the writing style could have been made a whole lot more smooth if they had opted for the just not $5 words, gone with the the more cultural or even some slang in there. And it was most awkward because some of the academic language popped up in the steamy scenes, which you gotta be real careful with the language you use in sex scenes, because those, contrary to popular belief, are actually really hard to do well, and using the wrong language in those scenes can destroy the mood. And I did struggle to get into it because of the stilted, overly academic writing in here. But that's fairly common, I think, for a lot of especially newer authors, because when we were growing up, we're taught all of these like hard and fast, you must do this writing rules, and then it turns out that's really only for writing nonfiction and academic, and when you go to write fiction, you actually need to write more relaxed, which this book could have used. Again, a lot of leeway can be given for writing style, but when the book is this long and it feels like the writing style is just padding things out, it kind of makes a lot of the pages feel superfluous. Like, hey, we could have cut this down a lot. And lastly, for a more negative side, this does not necessarily feel like, and again, it's going to get nitpicky, a fantasy romance. It feels like a fantasy with a romance. And again, it's one of those things where it's like, if you're really into certain genres, you can recognize the differences. But for example, like, it's 50 pages in before they even meet for the first time, because so much other like high fantasy war in a war with an evil empire stuff is going on. And then like there are major climactic scenes near the end that like one of the pair isn't even in, because it was someone else's entire arc going on entirely separate from the other person, like that kind of thing. It did not necessarily feel like there was enough of the romance as the base. It felt like fantasy was the base and romance was put on top of it. There was also a really weird moment, and I'm just now remembering this, where like there was world building put in like the last 150 pages that should have been in the first 50 pages. Like they're explaining how Blaze's family got from being in this town and being not like nobility, but like decently wealthy and connected, to being part of this resistance in this rundown keep. But all of that world building is done in the last 150 pages. And maybe the author knew that it was taking too long to get to the good stuff. But in all honesty, like, if it didn't fit at the beginning of the book, it doesn't necessarily fit any better near the end of the book. And again, with that whole romantic fantasy versus fantasy with a romance aspect, like, you don't actually need that much world building in a fantasy romance. You just need enough to set up the romance. So it definitely felt like, just in general, it felt like there was so much that could have been cut out to slim down such a chunky book. And as a result, that made the book not only be long, but feel long. Because as we all know, if the book is really well written, the page count doesn't necessarily matter. You'll feel like you're flying through it. I've read a 500-page book in a day because I was just that engrossed in the story. But this one, I definitely felt the length. I definitely felt like pushing through that many pages. But now let's go on to the good things. I did like at least a little bit of the world building, the concept of the setup with the evil empire and actively overtaking things, and the ancient dragons that like were a thing, maybe still are a thing, we're not sure, and the reveal of Keleth's curse and what he is was pretty nice. The romance, oddly enough, for how long this book is, the romance felt forced, a little too quick for how long this is. But it was cute, and there were points in the steamy scenes where the language like relaxed a little bit, and I could enjoy it. I love a lot of the mechanical concepts in the fantasy, the fairy doors specifically. I loved that idea. There was definite big stakes. The big bad felt like the proper big bad and properly evil and all of that. There was a nice cast of characters. There were a lot of really good ideas in here. I just wish that it was basically just a high fantasy. about the evil empire, maybe pull back on some of the Beauty and the Beast stuff that didn't necessarily fit. I liked the twist of how the curse gets broken. I liked a lot of the fairy magic type stuff was fun. I did not understand exactly the level of technology we were working with because it was definitely swords and sorcery, but also there are airships. But oh, the airships are magic and okay, like again, really thick book to not have a lot of detailed world building. So I'm not sure exactly how much was spent on what parts, but in general, I gave the book 3 stars. A lot of good ideas, but it does not justify its own length with how chunky it is. A lot could have been slimmed down. Maybe if the author had taken out all the extraneous parts from the Beauty and the Beast and slimmed down the language, they could have fit in more like natural world building aspects. They could have had room for it because it wouldn't have felt quite so padded out by other stuff. But regardless, if you do like a good high fantasy with big stakes, this is definitely the one. I will not be continuing with the series. Yes, even though the next book in this series has a sapphic romance, because as I have learned about myself recently, I tend to overhype sapphic romances in my head, and they tend to be the books that I'm most disappointed in when they turn out to be not great because I overhype them just for being sapphic romances. So I'm going to learn from my past struggles and pull back and just be like, okay, just because it's sapphic doesn't mean it's going to automatically be the best book ever. I need to calm my queer little heart. It's fine. But again, if you do like high fantasy and you want to jump into this series, I would suggest this one. And with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.